So Trump's 50% tariff threat landed after Canada's backup deal was already moving. The order covered roughly $28 billion in Canadian exports. It was scheduled to take effect on August 19th. It reached products as ordinary as beer, dairy ingredients, cement, plywood, electronics, furniture, and hockey sticks. Washington believed the 50% number would force Ottawa back to the table with fewer options and less time. But 4 days after the announcement, Canada concluded negotiations on a new trade agreement with the United Arab Emirates, while parallel arrangements with Europe, China, Indonesia, Qatar, and other markets were already being advanced. The pressure campaign was designed to expose Canadian dependence. Instead, it exposed how urgently Canada had been preparing to reduce it. Warren Buffett has warned for years that it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. Applied to this moment, the meaning is severe. The United States spent decades building the most valuable trade relationship on Earth, then placed a 50% tax over $28 billion in commerce, and assumed the other side had nowhere else to go. That assumption is the story. Because the backup was not a speech. It was not a threat drafted after the tariff order. It was a network of agreements, legal reviews, port strategies, defense partnerships, investment talks, and export corridors that had been moving for months. And according to officials familiar with the sequence, the most important Canadian decision was not to retaliate immediately. It was to let Washington believe the deadline was controlling the room, while Ottawa accelerated the alternatives already sitting on the table. When you hear what was inside those folders, what the 12 agreements represented, and what happened when Trump said Canada needed America but America did not need Canada, you will understand why trade officials are no longer describing this as a temporary tariff dispute. Hit subscribe, because the economic map of North America is being redrawn before the August 19 deadline. Let me give you the full context, because this did not happen in a vacuum. On July 1, the United States declined to extend the USMCA trade agreement for another 16 years. The agreement remained in force, but it entered an annual review cycle that can continue until 2036. For businesses, that did not mean immediate collapse. It meant something more corrosive: recurring uncertainty. A factory can manage a known tariff. A pension fund can price a known regulation. What neither can manage comfortably is a political system in which the rules governing $1.6 trillion in annual North American trade can be reopened every year. Then came the escalation. The United States had already imposed 25% duties on Canadian-built cars and trucks, and 50% duties on steel and aluminum. Canada wanted relief. Washington wanted concessions on dairy access, provincial alcohol restrictions, automobile rules of origin, and the treatment of foreign components. The United States opened more advanced talks with Mexico, while Canada remained outside the formal negotiating track. That created the first pressure point. Ottawa was being shown that the Continental Agreement could be redesigned around it. On July 20th, the second pressure point arrived. The White House invoked a rarely used provision of the Tariff Act of 1930 and announced additional 50% tariffs on broad lists of Canadian goods, effective August 19th. According to the White House fact sheet, the duties would apply even to covered goods that qualified under USMCA. According to an analysis cited by the Associated Press, about $28 billion in annual Canadian exports were exposed. $28 billion, a 50% rate, 30 days. Most Americans do not realize what Canada had been doing while Washington concentrated on the deadline. Ottawa had spent the previous year building redundancy. The government had set a goal of doubling non-U.S. trade within a decade. It had concluded or advanced arrangements with China, the European Union, Indonesia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, India, ASEAN, Thailand, the Philippines, and Mercosur. Prime Minister Mark Carney said Canada had signed 12 trade and security deals on 4 continents in 6 months. 12 deals, not one emergency announcement, 12 pieces of a larger structure. The numbers mattered. Canadian non-U.S. exports had reached $213.8 billion, up 16% in a year. The American share of Canadian exports had fallen from roughly 76% to nearly 70%. Canada was still deeply dependent on the U.S. market. No serious official denied that. But dependence was no longer being treated as a permanent condition. It was being treated as a risk concentration problem. That distinction changed Ottawa's preparation. The Canadian side prepared 2 tracks. The first was negotiation. Seek relief from the 50% tariffs, defend the continental supply chain, protect autos, steel, aluminum, agriculture, and energy. The second was execution. Accelerate agreements already negotiated, shorten legal reviews, expand export financing, align ports and rail capacity, and secure new investment in critical minerals, aerospace, agri-food, clean technology, and defense. Washington prepared a deadline. Ottawa prepared optionality. The emotional turning point came when Trump publicly said, "Mexico and Canada need us. We don't need them." That sentence was not simply political rhetoric. It was a statement of negotiating doctrine. It told Canadian officials that the American strategy rested on one belief: Canada had no credible alternative. And that is why the room in Ottawa mattered, because inside that room, officials were about to place the 50% tariff order beside the evidence that the belief was already out of date. The following scene is a reconstruction based on the public timeline, official documents, reported negotiating positions, and accounts from people familiar with the talks. The private words are necessarily composite. The decisions and the stakes are not. The meeting began after sunset in a secure conference room in Ottawa. The room was functional rather than grand. A long maple table, gray carpet, recessed lights reflected in two dark wall screens. Canadian and provincial flags stood in the corner. Outside, summer lights still held over the Capitol, but the blinds were drawn. At every seat sat the same three items: a black briefing binder, a printed copy of the American tariff proclamations, and a one-page calendar with August 19 circled in red. $28 billion, 50%, 30 days. The first screen showed the tariff lists: dairy ingredients, beer and wine, cement, plywood, furnishings, electronics, plastics, clothing, machinery inputs, hockey sticks. The products looked almost random until officials mapped them by constituency and supply chain. Then the design became clearer. The lists touched Quebec processors, Ontario manufacturers, British Columbia suppliers, prairie producers, Atlantic exporters, and hundreds of smaller companies that could not absorb a 50% border charge. The second screen showed a world map: Halifax to Rotterdam, Montreal to Antwerp, Vancouver to Yokohama, Prince Rupert to Southeast Asia, a Gulf route running toward Jebel Ali. Beside each line was a status marker: signed, concluded, under legal review, under negotiation, financing pending. The American order was one stack of paper. The Canadian backup was an operating system. According to officials familiar with Canada's planning, the first discussion was not about retaliation. It was about exposure. Finance officials walked through which companies could survive 30 days, which could survive 90, and which would begin layoffs before the tariff took effect, because customers would stop placing orders. A manufacturing advisor pointed to firms with fixed-price contracts. If the importer passed back the tariff, the Canadian supplier's margin disappeared. If the importer absorbed it, the American customer's cost rose. If both refused, the order vanished. There was no clean winner, only different ways to distribute the damage. One provincial representative pushed for immediate dollar-for-dollar retaliation. Another warned that restricting energy, potash, or critical minerals would fracture the Canadian coalition and invite a national security response. A third asked the question underneath everything: what would actually change the American calculation before August 19? The trade team opened the black binder. The first tab was marked UAE. 4 days after the tariff announcement, Canada and the United Arab Emirates would conclude negotiations on a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. The legal text still required review, signature, and ratification, but the commercial framework was done. It would reduce tariffs and red tape and improve access in engineering, aerospace, agri-food, clean technology, machinery, and motor vehicle parts. Existing two-way trade was $3.5 billion and had been growing about 10% annually. Not enough to replace the United States. Enough to prove the direction was real. The second tab was marked Europe. Trade under CETA had grown more than 75%. Merchandise trade had reached $134 billion. Canada and the European Union had launched digital trade negotiations, strengthened investment protections, and opened Europe's $1.1 trillion construction market more fully to Canadian firms. There was also a defense dimension. Canada had joined Europe's safe procurement framework, linking trade diversification to radar, aircraft, munitions, ships, and Arctic systems. The third tab was marked China. The arrangement was narrower and politically dangerous, but economically concrete. China was expected to reduce combined tariffs on Canadian canola seed from about 85% to approximately 15%. Ottawa estimated that the package could unlock nearly $3 billion in export orders. Again, not a substitute for the United States. A hedge, a pressure valve. Then came Indonesia, Qatar, India, ASEAN, Thailand, the Philippines. Mercosur, 12 trade and security deals across 4 continents, with more negotiations behind them. The room slowed. One official turned the August 19 calendar page face down. A call with Washington was placed on speaker. The American position, as described in public reporting and by officials familiar with the talks, was straightforward. The 50% rate was leverage. The deadline was intended to concentrate attention. Canada needed relief more than the United States needed Canadian concessions. Ottawa was expected to move quickly on dairy, alcohol, autos, and other disputes before the cost became intolerable. The Canadian side did not deny the exposure. It did not pretend $28 billion was small. It did not claim the 50% tariff could be ignored. The response was narrower. Canada wanted a comprehensive agreement, not temporary exemptions, and it would not sign a fast deal that could not survive the next annual review. The call ended without resolution. For several seconds, nobody moved. The speaker light went dark. A legal advisor capped a pen. An untouched cup of coffee had formed a thin brown ring beneath the lid. On the wall, the world map remained illuminated. Then an aide played the clip from Trump's interview. Mexico and Canada need us. We don't need them. No one interrupted it. The sentence ended, and the room held the silence. 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. The Prime Minister looked at the tariff proclamation, then at the UAE agreement, then at the map showing the 12 deals. The exact words in the room have not been released. But the public actions reveal the substance of the decision. Continue negotiating with Washington. Do not retaliate prematurely. And accelerate every credible alternative. Move the UAE legal review faster. Advance export credit support. Identify the first $3 billion in orders that could be redirected. Protect firms exposed to the $28 billion tariff list. Prepare the ports, rail corridors, and defense procurement links. And stop treating diversification as a distant aspiration. Treat it as an active national security program. A folder closed, quietly. On its cover were 2 words, U.S. contingency. The devastating irony was now visible. The 50% tariff had been designed to demonstrate that Canada had no backup. Instead, it supplied the political permission and urgency required to activate one. The tariff gamble did not catch Canada without a plan. It caught Canada halfway through executing it. And when the officials left that room, the next phase began moving faster than Washington expected. The immediate aftermath moved quickly, because the calendar did not care about political messaging. In Washington, the administration presented the 50% tariffs as proof that pressure was working. Trump repeated that Canada needed access to the American market and described tariffs as the path to American industrial independence. U.S. officials pointed to new factory investment and argued that companies could avoid the duties by building inside the United States. The message was strength, control, and inevitability. Ottawa's public response was deliberately different. Carney said Canada would intensify negotiations and would do whatever was necessary to defend Canadian interests. He said everything was on the table if no agreement was reached, but he refused to retaliate in advance. The restraint was not surrender. It preserved coalition unity, denied Washington an excuse for immediate escalation, and bought time for the backup architecture to move. Then came the line that revealed the collapse of trust. Asked whether Trump could be relied upon even if a deal were reached, Carney said the government, the negotiating team, and the premiers would have to be convinced that any agreement was worth the paper it was written on. Think about that for a moment. This was no longer only a dispute over dairy quotas or tariff schedules. It was a question of whether a signed agreement with the United States could be treated as a durable asset. For retirees, workers, and business owners, that distinction is enormous. A contract creates value because people expect it to survive. When that expectation weakens, companies delay plants, lenders raise the price of risk, pension managers reduce exposure, and suppliers hold more cash instead of hiring. The broad market did not deliver one cinematic collapse. The reaction was quieter and more consequential. According to Scotiabank Economics, The weighted effective tariff rate on Canadian goods sent to the United States would rise from about 5.5% to 8.6%. Across all Canadian goods exports, the rate would climb from about 4.2% to 6.5%. Those numbers sound technical until they reach an invoice. A covered shipment valued at $2 million could face a border charge approaching $1 million under the 50% rate. That is not a negotiating abstraction. That is payroll, credit capacity, and retirement savings being repriced. Procurement departments began asking suppliers for alternative sourcing plans. Exporters called banks about working capital lines. Importers examined force majeure clauses. Auto and metals firms delayed commitments because the larger USMCA questions remained unresolved. The three-country system that supports roughly $1.6 trillion in annual trade was being divided into separate negotiating tracks, and every division created another reason for capital to wait. The leaks were less dramatic than the competitor scripts Washington had become accustomed to, but more damaging. People familiar with the talks described the American assumption as simple. The August 19 deadline would force movement because Canada's exposure was immediate. Canadian officials, by contrast, kept repeating a phrase reported by business representatives close to the process. Canada wanted a good deal, not a fast deal. Then, on July 24th, the UAE negotiations were concluded. 4 days after the 50% tariff announcement. $3.5 billion in existing bilateral trade. Roughly 10% annual growth. New access across aerospace, agri-food, engineering, clean technology, machinery, and vehicle parts. The deal did not erase $28 billion of exposure, but it proved that the contingency plan was not waiting for Washington's permission. This is where Buffett's economic translation becomes useful. A tariff is supposed to increase the price of refusing your terms. But when the tariff also increases the value of building alternatives, the pressure begins financing the escape route. The cost Washington imposed was not only a cost to Canada, it was an incentive payment for Canada to diversify faster. And the next question was no longer whether the tariff hurt. It was whether the hurt would purchase American leverage or Canadian independence. That is the point Warren Buffett's philosophy forces into focus. He has never treated price and value as the same thing, and he has never treated leverage as whatever produces the loudest immediate reaction. Real leverage is durable. It improves your position after the excitement is gone. It gives you more choices next year than you had this year. By that standard, the tariff gamble has a serious accounting problem. Washington can point to the 50% headline. It can point to $28 billion in exposed Canadian exports. It can point to August 19 and say the clock belongs to the United States. But a serious investor would ask what the policy does to future cash flows, future investment, and the behavior of the counterparty. Does it make Canada more likely to sign a durable North American agreement? Or does it make Canada more likely to spend billions on ports, rail links, export credit, energy corridors, and foreign partnerships that permanently reduce American influence? The first effect is visible immediately. The second compounds. In more than 60 years of watching markets, sitting across negotiating tables, and studying businesses under pressure, the Buffett principle has been consistent. The strongest deal is not the one that leaves the other side trapped for a day. It is the one they still choose to honor when they have another option. A customer forced to buy from you is not a moat. A partner searching for the exit is not an asset. And a supply chain held together by political fear will be dismantled the moment capital finds a safer route. That is the economic translation. Canada still sends nearly 70% of its exports to the United States. That is enormous. It means Washington retains real leverage, but it is down from about 76% a year earlier, and Canadian non-U.S. exports have reached $213.8 billion. The trend is not theoretical, it is measurable. 12 trade and security deals on 4 continents are not enough to replace the United States, but they are enough to change the bargaining psychology. Every agreement creates another customer. Every customer supports another shipping route. Every route justifies another terminal, warehouse, insurance product, financing facility, and political constituency. Compounding works in both directions. For an investor, the most dangerous liability is often not the loss visible on today's statement. It is the behavior the loss causes tomorrow. A 50% tariff on sole $28 billion may protect selected American producers in the near term. It may also cause Canadian firms to redesign products for European standards, secure Gulf financing, contract Asian buyers, and build capacity that no longer assumes the American border will remain predictable. Once those costs are paid, the incentive to return weakens. This is especially important for viewers living on retirement income. Tariffs do not remain at the border. They travel through prices, margins, interest rates, and asset values. They appear in the cost of a refrigerator, a home renovation, a vehicle, a pension fund's industrial holdings, a utilities equipment budget, and a small business loan. The 50% number is collected from importers, but the economic burden is distributed across workers, shareholders, consumers, and communities on both sides. Your 401k lost 3% in a single quarter because of this trade war. And in my view, it is only going to get more expensive from here. Now, before I continue, I want to quickly mention something that I think every American over 60 needs to see right now. Everything we have been covering, the tariffs, the inflation, and the impact on retirement savings, I have compiled into a complete guide called the Buffett Blueprint. It applies Warren Buffett's investment principles to the specific threat this trade war poses to your retirement. Your 401k, your Social Security, and your fixed income are all covered, along with a practical protection plan you can start this week. The link is right below this video. It is called the Buffett Blueprint. Check it out. Now, back to the larger point. Buffett's reputation warning also applies at the institutional level. USMCA was not only a tariff schedule, it was a credibility instrument. Companies invested because they believed the framework would outlast a single speech or election. When annual reviews extend toward 2036, and covered goods can still face new duties, the agreement's legal text may remain in force while its economic value quietly erodes. The devastating verdict is therefore not that Canada has escaped American dependence. It has not. The verdict is that Washington used its leverage in a way that made escaping it a national objective. A tariff designed to make Canada more dependent made dependence itself politically toxic. That is the kind of strategic loss that does not appear on a customs receipt. It appears years later, when the factories, contracts, and loyalties have moved, and those movements are now spreading beyond trade. The economic consequences come first because concrete and contracts move faster than diplomacy. Canada's diversification program will not replace the United States next month. It does not need to. It only needs to redirect enough marginal growth to change future dependency. New export orders can be assigned to Europe, the Gulf, and Asia. New investment can be structured around Pacific and Atlantic ports rather than a single north-south corridor. New plants can be designed to meet multiple regulatory systems. Physical infrastructure does not unbuild itself when a president changes his tone. Contracts do not unsign. A company that spends 3 years and hundreds of millions of dollars qualifying a new market does not abandon it because Washington later offers a temporary exemption. That is why the $28 billion exposure and the 50% tariff cannot be judged only against this year's trade flows. They must be judged against the capital decisions they trigger. The United States may collect leverage before August 19 and lose market share for a decade. The political consequences follow. Ontario has the most immediate manufacturing exposure. Quebec faces pressure across processing, aerospace inputs, aluminum-linked industries, and consumer goods. British Columbia holds critical minerals and Pacific access. Alberta and Saskatchewan control energy and potash leverage, but resist measures that would injure their own producers. A prolonged dispute forces every premier to choose between continental integration and domestic political survival. It also brings American governors, senators, unions, farmers, builders, and manufacturers into the conflict. The United Steelworkers and the International Association of Machinists have already urged Washington to reconsider the Canadian tariffs and cooperate against unfair Chinese trade practices. The irony is devastating. A tariff policy advertised as protection for American workers is forcing American and Canadian unions to defend the integrated system against their own government's intervention. Then comes defense. NORAD does not operate in a separate universe from trade. Five Eyes intelligence sharing does not float above industrial capacity. Arctic surveillance depends on radar, satellites, aircraft, shipyards, communication systems, fuel, critical minerals, and trusted procurement. Canada possesses 10 of NATO's 12 defense critical minerals. It is increasing defense spending, investing in over-the-horizon radar, submarines, aircraft, and Arctic operations, and joining European defense procurement through SAFE. If Washington treats every economic dependency as a weapon, Ottawa has to ask whether defense procurement should also be diversified. That does not mean Canada abandons NORAD or Five Eyes. It means Canadian planners reduce single-source risk. European suppliers gain opportunities. Domestic production receives priority. Intelligence and military relationships remain, but the assumption of automatic industrial alignment begins to weaken. That should alarm anyone who remembers the Cold War. The northern defense of the continent depends on habits of trust built over generations. Those habits cannot be switched on only when missiles appear over the Arctic. The international signal is equally serious. Japan is watching. Germany is watching. Australia, South Korea, the United Kingdom, Poland, and the Philippines are watching. Their question is not whether Canada can replace the United States. Their question is whether an agreement with Washington remains durable when domestic politics change. If the closest American ally can face a 50% tariff on $28 billion in goods, despite a standing trade agreement, every other ally must price that risk into its own decisions. China and Russia do not need to defeat the North American alliance directly if North America weakens its own connective tissue. Beijing gains when Canada needs alternative buyers, capital, and processing capacity. Moscow gains when disputes complicate Arctic coordination. Every adversary benefits when economic coercion creates doubt inside defense partnerships. This is how cascading failure works. Stress from one direction can be absorbed. Trade stress, political stress, supply chain stress, retirement market stress, and defense stress arriving together begin to remove the options needed to solve each other. The problem becomes compoundingly harder. The 50% tariff was meant to narrow Canada's choices before August 19. Instead, the 12-deal strategy is widening them. And once those choices become infrastructure, Washington will no longer be negotiating with the Canada it believed it could corner. The facts now sit beside each other with uncomfortable clarity. A 50% tariff threatens roughly $28 billion in Canadian exports on August 19th. A continental trade system supporting about $1.6 trillion in annual commerce has entered a cycle of recurring uncertainty. Canada still depends heavily on the American market, but it has already signed or advanced 12 trade and security deals across 4 continents. 4 days after Washington announced the tariff, the UAE negotiations were concluded. The backup was already in motion. That does not mean Canada wins without pain. Workers can lose shifts. Small exporters can lose customers. American consumers can pay more. Retirement portfolios can absorb the slow damage of weaker margins, delayed investment, and higher risk premiums. Economic separation between neighbors this integrated is not clean. It is expensive, uneven, and dangerous. But strategy is measured by what a policy causes, not what it announces. The tariff was announced as strength. Its first strategic result was to accelerate the precise behavior it was supposed to prevent. Canada is moving customers, capital, procurement, and political attention toward alternatives. The United States still possesses enormous leverage. But leverage consumed carelessly is not power. It is an asset being liquidated. Warren Buffett's reputation principle leaves the final judgment. Trust compounds slowly, then disappears suddenly. A reliable partner can ask for sacrifice because the relationship has value. An unpredictable partner must pay for every concession because no promise is assumed to last. That is the philosophical dividing line in this dispute. One side believed dependence guaranteed obedience. The other decided dependence had become the danger. $28 billion. 50%. August 19. 12 deals. Those are not just numbers now. They are the coordinates of a structural change. The negotiations in Washington will continue. There may be exemptions. There may be an interim agreement. There may even be a public declaration of victory. But ports will still be expanded, foreign agreements will still be ratified, defense procurement will still diversify, and companies will still remember why they paid to build a second route. The tariff deadline is approaching. The backup plan is already moving. And every day before August 19, it becomes harder to stop. Before you go, I mentioned it earlier, and I mean it. If this trade war has you even slightly worried about your retirement, the Buffett Blueprint is the guide I put together for exactly this moment. Your 401k, your Social Security, and your fixed income, one plan, written in plain English, that you can start using this week. The link is right below this video and in the pinned comment. The Buffett Blueprint. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.